loud enough? You can't hear me? No, that's fine. Um, the city of Ekurhuleni, if you're not familiar with South Africa, the city of Ekurhuleni and Johannesburg are neighboring each other. So we're in Gauteng province in South Africa. So the assessment was done using three methodologies or approaches. One being a community-based assessment, where we recruited community volunteers to do the assessment. Secondly, being indoor assessment, the guys will give you the technical um, background on how the assessments were done. And then the third part was the modeling. To start my presentation, I will share a video. I will share a video that summarizes the project and then on the key emerging outcomes from the assessment.
All the people are looked at by community leaders and personnel that they trust. We introduce them to not only the work they're doing today, but actually what the work is about. So we make sure that a lot of our work focuses on what climate change means, and specifically what it means for them. We localize the idea of climate change as much as possible. The log of action determine is actually how much stress we are getting from so not only the temperature or the actual heat that's coming from the sun, we're also looking at things like the heat of the wind that's passing through, the levels of humidity in the air, the amount of geothermic radiation that's coming from the floor. It's just a combination to see all the factors of heat that put stress on our everyday lives. We want to get all the data that we collected from all 6 places and see what patterns we can see from the data that's collected. And from that, hopefully, we can pull some solutions out about what we can do to mitigate climate change and heat stress in the most affected areas. I think when people think about climate change, we think about the giant corporations that are spewing all the pollution into the air. And we always think of it at that meta scale. And I think people need to care about it more so that we can bring the idea of climate change way more to a micro scale and a more personal scale.
Um, thank you. I think one of the reflections from this project and using community based volunteers has been the value that using local people could offer to the project. In one fold, it allows you to ground truth and make sure that the modeling work and the outputs from the project are validated. And then secondly, it began to create an awareness in the local communities. So the next part of my presentation is just like a highlight or an overview of some of the key messaging that we got from this assessment. I think the first one is the sharp disparities that one gets in heat intensity. Neighborhoods with uh, densely packed housing and buildings with no tree cover face are at risk of more extreme heat, as opposed to the richer communities. I'll give an example of where the two areas where the assessment was undertaken. So at the top there, you've got Ivory Park or Tembisa, which would be the what we call in South Africa townships, and in other areas you find informality existing in that area. So those areas are characterized, as you can see at the top. My point is really not working. In the image on the top right, those would be an example of what an area like in Ivory Park or Tembisa looks like, characterized by dense housing, no tree shading, and in other cases, you're finding that people are living in shacks. And then at the bottom there, um, at the bottom, you would find an area like Nokem Park. Nokem Park would be characterized as much as it may not be the upper class or richer area, but it would be relatively more affluent compared to the Tembisa. So what we're seeing and what came out of the study is how heat is most likely how the heat intensity is going to affect the areas more at the top. So as you can see, the areas at the top are more red as compared to Nokem Park. And this is just because of the non-existent urban green infrastructure. So already what this begins to give us as city officials is where we need to be addressing our efforts. So a lot of this work for us in terms of what for the city is our question has been, so what does it mean for our department? So what does it mean for our parks department? What does it mean for our housing department? What does it mean for a disaster risk and management? And even our health sector as well. So and then secondly, what we're seeing in this next slide is that what most of Johannesburg currently gets about 20 hot nights per year. So what we're characterizing as hot nights are nights where heat is above 20 degrees Celsius. And then with the projections under the medium and high climate change scenarios, we saw that poor neighborhoods will see 80 to 120 of these nights. So you can imagine you stay in a shack or you stay in a house that's not really well ventilated, you do not have aircon. So now in under these scenarios, under the increased heat, people are going to be experiencing even hotter nights. I'm already battling right now. So what that means as well is it's starting to draw the nice direct linkage between climate risk and public health and how that's going to impact mortality and health impacts. the the next one as well, which is quite an interesting finding, and I think this project's been quite nice because it gives us data. As climate change specialists within the city, we know the argument for making certain changes for urban greening, for nature-based solutions, but so often we lack data to support our arguments. We're dealing with councillors, we're dealing with structures, and currently we're dealing with a city that doesn't have funding. So if you're trying to motivate for any urban greening, wetland rehabilitation project, you're competing against high priority projects. But what this work began to give us is that direct link between risk and human health and the evidence base. So what you're seeing here, the four pictures that I'll be speaking about. There was an indoor monitoring that was done, and the outcomes that you saw from this is that your actual your actual structure, your housing structure affects your inside temperatures. So what the results from what the volunteers came back with was indoor temperature different indoor temperatures differed by by about 8 degrees between some of the houses at the bottom and at the top. What you're seeing at the top on the left would be your normal residential block of flats, and then this would be your relatively affluent residential area as compared to a township area and an informal settlement. So we're already seeing the people that are going to be most vulnerable to heat, it's going to be the people that are in these sort of housing structures. And in South Africa, if you've read our history, there's the history of racial segregation. As much as we can say we way past that, and it's been so many years, the impact that this has left, or yeah, in spatial planning, is still very much visible. So if you've been to Cape Town, you drive into the airport, you see informality, then immediately you get to our beautiful beaches, which are amazing, and our beautiful Table Mountain. So this exists everywhere. So inequality exists in economically, but then spatial segregation also exists. So as much as it no longer is racial, but it's very much spatial segregation, and it's a historical urban planning. So what you're seeing in the left is at the top would be your densely populated poor areas as opposed to relatively more affluent areas. And as you can see, there's less to no green infrastructure at the top as opposed to the bottom. So what does that mean? It means if you're going to be getting more heat, extreme heat, the houses at the top are more exposed and vulnerable. And these maps are just re-emphasizing the point that where there's no tree canopy or green infrastructure, you are going to be getting increased heat or heat risk. So the next part I think is going to make me less nervous because it's my turf. The next part is more the action. So what should we be doing as cities? Um, the city of Johannesburg and the city of Ekurhuleni, both of us have action plans, and we've been on this journey of ensuring that we are coming up with adaptation and climate adaptation and mitigation actions for our city towards making sure that towards building climate resilient cities. However, what we're seeing in both strategies is that as much as there's been emphasis that has been placed around droughts and flooding action plans, adaptation action plans, there is still a gap. There's still a gap in terms of integrating heat into our action plans. So the starting point in terms of what the cities should be doing, what both cities should be doing, is around ensuring that heat responses are integrated into our key strategic plans. And then secondly, it's mainstreaming mitigation across all city strategies. The first thing and the important thing is understanding that heat is not an environmental issue. It's not just an environmental department issue. So action and action planning does not need to be centralized within the environmental department. So the next important point is ensuring that there's a cross-departmental, cross-sectoral approach towards addressing heat, and implementation happens at various points of the city, considering appointing a city heat officer to work across departments and driving actions, ensuring that there's coordination in those actions, and most importantly, including heat in key departmental strategic plans. Um, the last one is just a summary. There's a number of adaptation. There's a number of strategic adaptation measures that we have proposed and are considering for the city, and will be including in our action plans as the city. The first one is about strategic urban greening in underprovisioned areas. This means prioritizing greening initiatives for your township areas, your informal areas. So this would include even tree planting campaigns, pledging to plant certain amounts of trees by a certain a period, and then secondly, cooling strategies for low quality dwellings. We need to be looking at how we could be cooling these informal settlements or township areas. In South Africa, you could never say you're going to move people to cooler areas because the history of land removal does not allow you to do that. But the city has, in many cases, a lot of housing upgrades plans. So we need to be making sure that those housing upgrading plans or inside upgrading plans actually include these adaptation measures that we're looking at. So this could also even include a cool roofs programs, planting trees in these neighborhoods. Um, Thirdly, protecting indoor and outdoor public spaces from excessive heat. You find that people end up queuing for certain things at schools or clinics. So ensuring that there's in those areas, in those areas you are providing, you are addressing you are planting trees and you're providing and addressing the cooling needs of the public. Um, and another one from a people perspective, we need to be that we've emphasizing and going to be looking at is partnering with the Department of Health, your research institutes, and also your research institutes, and also your South African Weather Services for an early warning system around heat health. And then also prioritizing awareness and behavior changes. So I think an approach like that we've done to actually even conduct the assessment involving community members, we need to be going back and actually educating people around the impacts of heat and what that could do on the elderly. So focusing more on communication and getting the information there, and also making sure that our early warning system can be understood by people that are not even educated. So it's all about accessibility. We know it's a risk, we've demonstrated that, but I think a lot of our education and awareness programs need to be targeted at the most vulnerable people. And then lastly, some of the work that we've been doing as well has given us interesting information around the impact of heat on productivity and the impact of heat on our infrastructure. So there's a lot of work that we need to be doing around ensuring that we are your OHS systems are responding to that. And as a city as well, we're starting to begin to look at how do you integrate risk into your climate change into your core operations. Uh, That's thank you.
Thank you, Knox, for that wonderful presentation, despite all the hiccups and the late start. So next to the floor is Nick Jones from the World Bank.
Hi, everyone. So great to be here today to talk about innovative assessment methodologies for heat stress. And thanks so much, Knox, for getting us started, and Nuala for hosting us. So let me jump right in. So we wanted to talk today about innovations in measuring heat stress. But actually, having said that and reflecting on the history of approaches to measuring heat, actually people have been innovating to measure heat stress for a good 200 years. And there's a consideration that I want to really underscore, which is that we need to not reinvent the wheel in how we go about this, but we have to situate ourselves with today's technologies, but within a scientific tradition of measuring and understanding heat in city. So with that, I just wanted to mention that we have brought some heat sensors here today, and Niels and Philippe from Vito have very kindly brought the heat sensors that were used in the Johannesburg work. As you see, we have one set up in the shade, and we have one set up in direct sunlight. So as we talk, we are doing a scientific experiment about the heat stress in this very particular climate that we're in right now. And we have also brought a sensor mounted to a bicycle that the organizers kindly lent us. And in my presentation, I'm going to particularly focus on a pretty helpful approach, which is the vehicle traverse method, which means riding around a city with a motor car, a bike, or a motorbike. So let me jump in, but I wanted just to jump back in time a little bit and situate this in context. So really, there have been three phases in heat assessment methodologies, and the older phases are sometimes overlooked. But right back in the 1800s is when people started measuring the climate of cities in a systematic way and trying to isolate the influence of the built environment that is making our cities hotter. Then through the 1920s to the 1940s, that's when we actually saw the first applications of this kind of vehicle-based measuring technique that we have been using in Indonesia. And then fast forward to recent decades, where we've seen a real blossoming of science in this area, and application of data technologies, we have seen an increased closeness of this field with meteorology and weather forecasting, and the development of physically based models of the urban climate. Bringing us towards the predictive science. So the really classic study is by this guy called Luke Howard. You can look up his plaque on a door in Tottenham in London, who measured the heat island effect in London back in the 1820s. And then subsequently, there were some very interesting studies using the early motor car in the 1920s, when people came up with the idea that we've been measuring temperatures in cities with individual weather stations located like at Greenwich Observatory and then out in the countryside or at specific locations. But we know that there is variation of a high degree of detail within the urban landscape. How do we get a whole bunch of measurements right across the city in a controlled format within while controlling for the influence of time and the changing heat during the day? Well, why don't we put the thermometer on the car? And that was actually done first in Germany, leading to the kind of map of what appears to be an island. It's very similar to a topography map. And actually the term urban heat island was first coined in German. Statisch Heatinsel, if my pronunciation is okay. So, so bringing it back to the present day, measuring heat exposure, why and how? So we're concerned with heat in cities for a bunch of reasons, but one of them is that human beings are adapted to a particular ecological niche. We maintain a core body temperature of 37 degrees centigrade. And if your child has a fever, you put the thermometer in their mouth and you see that their core temperature is getting too high. You don't want your core temperature to go too high. Human beings cannot cope above a given level. And the literature in this area is derived from a variety of different fields. In fact, sports science is a very important source of some of these studies. And the devices that you're seeing here, the wet bulb globe temperature monitors, these are what are used at the Olympics and the World Cup to determine if play can go forward. The table here is showing you different wattage levels of physical exertion and what is a safe temperature. So if you're undergoing very, very, very strenuous sports and the wet bulb globe temperature is above 25 degrees, play should stop, because you can see health-related industries. So we need to learn from these fields and bring them into how we plan cities. So around the world, we're seeing a whole wonderful variety of different actions and experimentation in cities, from introducing early warning systems to planting trees and parks, to trying to fit school buildings and playgrounds so that children out at play in tomorrow's climate are not going to get heat stroke. But really, it's a pretty complicated thought process if you're in city government, to go from initial awareness to gathering some evidence to bringing everybody on board and then finally getting some actions made. It's pretty difficult. So our contention is that actually this stage, so heat mapping and citizen engagement, is what can help to unlock action and to build that momentum forward. So I wanted to quickly give an overview of what we've been doing in Indonesia using smartphones and motorbikes. The vehicle traverse method that was first applied in Germany in the 1920s is incredibly helpful today, and it's being used to very great effect, particularly in the United States, where NOAA has sponsored an annual program in which cohorts of cities are supported to mobilize volunteers and get people out in their own cars with heat sensors and make maps of their city's heat. And the process looks pretty much like this. We mobilize interested civic groups, provide equipment, set a campaign date, which is when the weather forecasts say we're going to have a really hot day that we want to measure, and we get people out to do it. In Bandung, Indonesia, these are the routes that our volunteers who are with the Technical University of Bandung followed, riding their motorbikes equipped with the type of sensor that you see over there. And these are some of our wonderful volunteers from ITB, who are generally graduate students and recent graduates. Doing this allows us to produce a number of heat map outputs and then go into all the analytics that you might want to do about the relationship between heat and green, the relationship between heat and impervious surface, or green and the socioeconomic characteristics. And we added on an additional element using smartphones. So if you have damp in your basement, or if you're concerned about your electric wiring being faulty, you can buy a small thermal imagery camera called a FLIR camera, which costs about $200 and you can fit it onto your iPhone. I've got one in my bag over there. So we brought one of these and got the students to go out with these cameras. And these were the simple instructions. We were asking them to identify a place of interest, somewhere where people are affected by the heat or the cool in their everyday lives. And go to the start point, fill out a simple smartphone survey, take a thermal image and an ordinary image, and provide us some couple of lines of reflection. Why is it hot here? Why does it matter? And this is what our very simple smartphone survey looked like. It took about half an hour to create. And based on this, we have a map with a variety of places identified by the local people and accompanying images, together with a quote about why it matters and what interventions in the built environment could make it cooler. So this is just one more example of a innovative method that we think can help drive some engagement and help get those to the action plans that can fit out today's city for tomorrow's hotter climate. I'm going to leave you with one final slide. This is called Take Your Pick. So based on the existing approaches to mapping and analyzing heat, really each approach has got its faults and its advantages. And depending on your budget, your time, your objectives, you want to be having a look at the methods and taking your pick. Satellite imagery, these days it's free, quick, very helpful as a first look, but it only captures land surface temperature, which is the equivalent of if you take your finger and you touch the ground, you touch the surface exposed to the air. That's what you're measuring. Vehicle traverse is wonderfully participatory, and it captures heat and humidity right across the city. Wet bulb globe temperature is the most comprehensive measure of heat stress. It captures air temperature, humidity, but also the effect of standing in direct sunlight, that radiative energy from the sun, and that's why it's used to determine if sports games can continue or if it's safe for workers in the factory. Lastly, urban climate modeling. As mentioned in the past couple of decades, we've seen incredibly quick progress towards making computer models that understand the atmosphere, the interaction of the sun and the atmosphere with the Earth's surface, given the city fabric, and can model it forward given climate scenarios, which our colleagues from VITO are masters at and will tell you about. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Nick. So our next presenter is joining us online, and it is Sachit Balsari from Harvard Medical School.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Wonderful. Thank you for inviting me over here. I hear a little bit of an echo, but if it's all right at your end, I'll proceed, yes? Great. I'm going to go on unless I hear one of you say otherwise.
Yeah, go ahead. Can you hear us?
Yes, I can now.
Yes, we have you on screen now. Go ahead.
Great. Thank you. Just by way of introduction, I'm a practicing emergency physician at the medical and the public health schools here at Harvard, and a lot of my work is at the intersection of complex humanitarian emergencies and disasters. I'm sorry I was unable to join you there in person, so I will keep my remarks brief, as it really isn't fun to watch anyone on screen and what sounds like a wonderful live event. I will contribute to what Nooks and Nick talked about by just sharing some stories from the field that I recently experienced. A couple of weeks ago, I was in India meeting with the representatives of the Self-Employed Women's Association. That is a group of disadvantaged but highly empowered women.
Okay, so we've had some issues with the internet, so I think we're going to move swiftly on in the interest of time. Oh, are you back?
Oh, I have, it has been clear from my end.
Okay, no, we lost you momentarily, so you're going to have to start again. Okay.
Happily. Okay.
Thank you very much.
No worries. I'll start again. I was going to contribute to what Nick and Nooks talked about by just sharing some field experiences that I had recently from the context of complex humanitarian emergencies and disasters, which I've studied for close to 2 decades. Can you still hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you perfectly.
Great. A couple of weeks ago, I was in India meeting with representatives of the Self-Employed Women's Association. This is a group of disadvantaged but highly empowered women, 2 million, in fact, that work in the informal economy. Their various trade unions and cooperatives comprise of artisans, salt pan workers, farmers, rag pickers, paper sorters. They work in kitchens and so on. Their collective is what gives them bargaining power. I had the opportunity to ask them to describe how they experienced recent heat waves in India. Here is their story in their own words that I have translated. The women want to work earlier in the day now. This year, the wheat harvesting time was changed from 10 a.m. to 6:30 a.m. The farm owners did not agree to this easily. It took us a lot of negotiation with them to make them understand that we are human too, and that our bodies cannot tolerate these temperatures. Now we have to go back to the fields in the evenings. We never used to do that. For the past 5 or 6 years, the temperature seems to have consistently risen. The last 2 years have been the worst. The number of hours that we can work outdoors has decreased, and since we're wage workers, our income has also decreased. That is another reason we go back to the fields in the evening. During the day, it has become very hard to work. We get blisters on our skin. We put neem leaves on them to cool it. Our skin would nevertheless peel. The heat also affects education. It is too hot for the children to even go to school. We had to get the school times changed as well for the school to start sooner. They did, but the schools then ended at noon, and the roads used to become so hot, and our children do not have footwear, so the kids would burn their souls walking home on the dirt roads. Even on the salt pans, it was so hot that the salt started getting spoiled. And then the unseasonal rain spoiled all the harvested salt. Our girls then faced the worst challenges because the temporary shelters in the salt pans were all destroyed due to the combination of unseasonal rains and the heat waves. Our girls therefore had no privacy, nowhere to go to use the toilet. It was so hot, the water we had became so hot to drink that our organization had to transport cold water to the desert. And melons. Women faced a lot of gynecological issues. Because they could not bathe, they suffered from a lot of infections and rashes, and they did not have access to the care they need. And if the doctor was male, they would not go see them. A farmer said, "In this extreme heat wave, our animals either become sick or they die. These animals cost rupees 50,000 or more, and then the animal just dies. There's not enough grass or hay for them, and the animals starve. The fodder becomes very expensive. Our sisters can barely pay for all this. The animals die and we suffer such huge losses. No income, and all this loss from just the heat waves. In the heat waves, our crops get destroyed, they get desiccated. There is not enough water to keep irrigating the fields, and small farmers suffer the most. Yesterday's rain, for example, destroyed all the standing crop. It rained for a week, so there is nothing left. These longer rainy seasons are not good either. The small farmers don't have any insurance. And when there is insurance, their availability is limited by several issues. It kicks in only if more than 33% of the crop is destroyed. No compensation if less. And the insurance only goes to the farm owners anyway, never to the farm hands. They lose income permanently. The way rainfall is calculated is problematic. They go according to jurisdictional boundaries, but the rain does not respect their borders. So sometimes they will say it rained, though it has not, and vice versa. It would be good to have technology that can accurately ascertain where it rained and where it did not, and how much in each case. Relief is not given according to what is destroyed, but more according to these borders. The small farmers and huts end up getting no relief. The stories go on and on, sort of 40 to 50 hours of these recordings. You look at the urban markets, and there's also tension between the communities. So I remember speaking to these vegetable vendors that said when it got really hot in the city of Ahmedabad, they brought these large umbrellas to sort of put over their vegetable stands. But the police came and took the umbrellas out because they were blocking the CCTV cameras of the posh buildings behind them. I think as we reimagine what heat adaptation looks like, we must remember to not be only thinking about the built environment and about urban dwellings, but also to think about what work will look like in these environments. We must reimagine what work outdoors looks like, what is bearable, and what will become untenable. We will not only need to think of material and technical interventions, but as members of this audience very well know, we will also have to think about what kind of financial instruments will protect the most vulnerable of our communities. And for this, we need an extraordinary amount of contextual intelligence, the sort that Knox and Nick talked about. There may be insurance when rain fails, but there still is not when there is excess rain or unseasonal rain or heat. Supply chains will have to be reimagined as they have not before, because even just-in-time delivery of agricultural products without cold chains may no longer be feasible, and simply expanding cold chains, even when financially viable, will do little to mitigate climate change. Interventions we need require participation from multiple stakeholders, as Knox demonstrated in her talk and as we heard from these farming women. School times and farming times may have to be changed. Many outdoor laborers will need protective footwear, for example, something we assume is universal and is certainly not. Footwear, not solar panels only. Who knew? At the South Asia Institute at Harvard, where I work, we're about to launch a climate adaptation project in partnership with community-based organizations across South Asia, as we think about adaptation along 4 dimensions: technical material adaptations, financial instruments, law and policy, and education. We plan to do this by working with communities to identify their greatest concerns as their climate changes, as they face an increasing number of extreme weather events, and as they brace themselves for forced displacement as their lands become no longer arable or get flooded. Or worse, they are unable to move even if they want to. As communities have reminded all of us often, we should be planning nothing about the community without the community. Thank you for listening, and thank you for inviting me here.
Thank you very much, Sajid, for that wonderful presentation. And we're on to our last presenters. And today we have Niels Souvrians and Philippe Lefebvre from Vito. And I think Niels is going to speak to you.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me here for Vito. We are a company located in Belgium, and our specific department is specialized in climate modeling and specifically on the urban scale. So that's why our presentation will be about high-resolution heat modeling, and we will focus on the UrbClim model, which is our model that we developed at Vito to really look at these urban scales. Very quickly, why do we need this information? What we normally use when we have climate models, we talk about a scale of 10 kilometers or more. So cities are not represented in there. As you can see, the temperature, even if there are cities, it's similar over the whole continent. But if you zoom in and you really focus on these cities, you see that, like Nick has shown and also Knox has said, these cities are more warmer than the rural counterparts. That's why it's needed to have a higher resolution. And that's where our UrbClim model kicks in. So it's a boundary layer model. I will not go into the details. If you're really interested, please come to us after this presentation. But what we can do is we can go to 30-meter resolution, as is shown here. This is the city of Brussels, capital of Belgium, and you can really see that the city area is really popping up, being warmer than the rural counterparts. But we don't stop there. We even go to the street level and the individual, like the meter scale level. And then you can really see some very nice details that are popping up, like certain streets that are much hotter than other streets, where, for example, trees or other measures are taken to tackle heat stress. So, okay, that for the theoretical basis. So I will now go on to the results that some results that we have produced. Okay, so this is the capital of Romania, Bucharest, for example, and I show here the urban heat island. And on the left you see the daytime urban heat island, and on the right is the nighttime. What do we see during the day? We see that the concrete and all the asphalt, for example, makes the city hotter of approximately 1 degree compared to the rural counterpart. The real urban heat island effect you see at night. During the day, the sun has heated up the city, the buildings, the streets, and that heat is captured in these materials and is only given away during the night. And that's why you see temperatures up to 4 degrees higher than the rural counterparts in the city. What is nice here in this example, I want to show here is that the high resolution that we provide at 30 meters, that you can really zoom into specific features. So you can even distinguish like individual parks, areas where trees are located in very high detail. And that is nicely shown at the top there. This is a second example. Here we checked also the climate change signal. I show you two figures. On the top you have the number of days that are above 35 degrees. We are in Cambodia, in Phnom Penh, the capital of Cambodia. And at present day, you can see that the number of days where the temperature does not go above 35 degrees is quite limited, about 30, 40 degrees each year. But if we go to the future, so you can see two scenarios that are listed here. The top one is a scenario of the Paris Agreement, so the 1.5 degree maximum heating. And 370 is the present commitments, so up to 3 degrees warming. And you can see considerable differences depending on the pathway that we will choose and the number of days that will go above 35 degrees. And yeah, it's without saying that this is a huge impact on the people that are living in the city. Similar here for the nights. Here you can really see the city popping up, being warmer. Nights above 25 degrees, which makes it very difficult to get rest and sleep well. I can see that again, depending on the future scenario, what we will choose, 1.5 or the present commitments, that we will get really a huge increase in these very hot nights, and it will make it very hard for people to live in these cities. Here is a last result that I want to show about this modeling. This is for the city of Niamey, which is capital of Niger. And in this one, we also took into account the growth of the city. So there is a huge population expansion expected in the city, which is shown here. So this is the present day situation, and this on the right is probably the city extent in 2050. And what is shown on the right is the number of heatwave days, and also again for three scenarios. So a low emission, a medium emission, and a high emission scenario. And you can really see that it will, depending on the scenario that we will go to, will really have a huge effect on the citizens that are living there, and with huge increases of heat stress that people will experience there. Okay, now these instruments that were standing here in front of us. We have had already some talks by Nick and Knox about it. It's a wet bulb globe thermometer, and it measures actually the heat stress that the human experiences when being at that location. It takes into account three measures: air temperature, the black globe temperature, and natural wet bulb temperature. So relative humidity, radiation of the sun, and the air temperature that is present. And that is combined and together in one measure. And that measure gives an idea of the heat stress that a person experiences when being on that location. Why do we need these measurements? Yeah, first thing is to evaluate our models. So this is from the Johannesburg project, for example, where we did a lot of field campaigns with these measurement. People were walking around, and we used it to compare with our model results. And it really gave a good relation between what we modeled and what we measured in heat stress. Secondly, you can also use it to really get an idea of how the heat stress is experienced at a certain location. This is again for the city of Niamey. I've selected 3 city quarters. Like the top one and the lower one are city quarters with quite a dense amount of buildings, a lot of pavements, not a lot of green. While the middle one is a city quarter where there's a lot of trees, green, urban greenery. And this is reflected in the amount of heat stress that is experienced at these 3 locations. So we had these wet bulb globe thermometers there, one in the sun, one in the shade. So the full line is the sun, the dashed line is in the shade. And you can clearly see that the thermometers that were in the sun experienced much more higher heat stresses than the ones in the shade. What is very special to see is like the city quarter that has the most green clearly has the lowest heat stress, both in the sun and in the shade. And even like at the end of the afternoon, the city quarter that had the most green has less heat stress in the sun than the other quarters in the shade. So that really gives an idea of what this cooling effect of urban vegetation can do and can mean for the people that are living there. Lastly, these measurements from heat stress, they can be translated into impacts. Of course, if the heat stress is too high, you cannot function anymore, you cannot work anymore. So this has an effect on the amount of work that a person can do outside, for example. This is a graph on the left here, again for these 3 city quarters, showing how much hours that are lost because the temperature is just, or the heat stress is just too high. And at present, these are 500 hours per year, which is quite okay. But checking towards the future, this can go up to 1,000. So a doubling in the amount of hours that is lost that you just cannot work anymore because it's too hot, and you will really face health issues if you still work outside. Of course, if you can, this is also seen here on the figure in the right. This gives an idea of how the mortality can increase towards the future with the increase in temperatures that we see. And we can see that you have 4% chance of more chance to die because of heat with these changes in temperatures towards the future. But this really has, heat stress really has a big impact on all of us. Now I want to see if the experiment here has worked. So maybe Philippe, what did we measure in the shade? Let's see. Yeah, okay, so the heat stress measured in the shade is at 27. The 27, that corresponds to low heat stress, not a lot, still fine, you're in the shade there. We check over here, we go to up to 30 in the WBGT. So that's already giving quite moderate to high heat stress. It's normal if you stand here, I experience more heat stress than when standing here. But it's nice that the instruments also give this result in the experiment kind of work. Okay, that concludes my presentation. If you have any questions about the instruments or on the modeling, feel free to contact me or my colleague Philippe.
Great. Thank you very much, Niels. I'm conscious that we're a little bit low on time, but does anybody have a question for any of our panelists?
Just basically 2. In terms of, this is very interesting. Thank you so much. This paper going forward, how do you see this now being integrated, for example, into the training for civil engineers in terms of designs, looking at guidelines for community development, cities, towns, that sort of thing, earthenwares, parks, etc. And in terms for small island developing states who may have a significant resource challenge, is there any chance per se of looking at development of, let's say, for example, low-cost instrumentation that has some significant level of accuracy that can be trained, for example, for local technicians to be able to build so that they can be utilized, for example, in Ministry of Education and schools, in the construction sector, the tourism sector, the cultural sector for outdoor activities, and therefore allowing small and developing states to develop these somewhat lower tech instrumentations for greater measurement to have a better disaggregation of data that can then be uploaded to other institutions like the CIMH, Caribbean Institute of Meteorology, etc. So, and provide that data that assists on the regional and global level for more accurate heat mapping.
Neil, do you want to start off? I can come in on the second. Do you want to come in on the first together with Knox?
Yeah. So, like on the first question on adaptation in the city. So, what things that are being done? So, at the end of the Johannesburg project, we listed a set of these measurements that can be taken, and we advised gave some high-level advice on how we can make the city more resilient to heat stress. Like you said, it is needed to have more this interaction with the city, the builders that are making the new buildings, for example, and make them aware of what they can do. Like a simple thing is like painting your roof white instead of black. That is something very simple that can be done, and that sometimes civil engineers or building companies don't do or don't know that this can have a serious effect on people. And that is something that indeed needs to improve towards the future. And that is certainly our responsibility to bring all this information to the civil engineers or the building companies or in the cities. And that's what we also try to do in the Johannesburg project. And I'm very glad that we had this partnership with Johannesburg and Ekurhuleni, because we really had an impact there on what will be done regarding the structure of the city and making it climate resilient towards the future. I don't know, Knox, if you still...
Thank you. I think for us as a city, the outcomes of this work begin to inform firstly our disaster risk and vulnerability assessments. So we already have a plan in place, but then this is more live, more up-to-date information. So the outcomes, especially the maps as well, because they're easily understandable by city official. So the outcomes, it's firstly to integrate into that space. And then secondly, as a climate change function, we don't do any implementation. So we drive policy, we develop strategies. So the next step is to now work with the relevant line departments to say, this is what we're identifying as a risk for the city. How can we incorporate it into all implementation plans? So going to housing, saying, okay, you've got plans to upgrade housing. How do you include, or how do you begin to conceptualize and integrate this risk into your future plans? Going to our real estate department in city planning to say, okay, in any housing plan, in any development plans, how do we make this mandatory? So it may start from a climate change perspective, but the mainstreaming and the implementation really needs to happen across the city. And what we in the next I guess the next couple of years for us what becomes important is the monitoring and ensuring that it's happening, and ensuring that we've got champions across the different city. And out of interest as well, just sharing something else, we've started working with our internal auditing team to integrate risk as something that needs to be looked across the city. So going to individual departments to say, we know climate change is a risk and disaster risk. We know climate change and disaster risk are big for the city. How are you beginning to work with the climate change strategies that exist to incorporate and come up with mitigating factors around that? So starting to look at risk, and this is a good example, as something that just shouldn't just live within our climate change strategies and climate change action plans, but live more on the departmental sector plans and actually being reported on, and to say, okay, how are we addressing that?
Picking up on what Knox is saying, I think that the integration of thinking about heat in city planning guidelines can be really powerful to drive some change. And I think there are two parties that can help with that. One is city government as a standard setter and a democratic agent. But the other is civil engineers associations and urban planners associations, which can really help come up with those design guidelines that integrate these considerations. There's one from far across the world that has struck me is actually Hong Kong, which is a city that has been exposed to a lot of heat stress. And they've had some particular issues. They've really pioneered getting all of the engineers and real estate developers on board with some principles about how to design in a heat-sensitive way. They have a urban design handbook that has wonderfully clear illustrations about a heat sensitive versus a non-heat sensitive design. And for example, it's a coastal city which has wind flow from off the shore into the city. And at one stage, they were building a lot of skyscrapers right on the shoreline that blocked the airflow and resulted in stagnant, hotter air, which also gathered air pollution inland a bit, where most of the people spend their time. And they've really managed to get guidelines that are quite powerfully accepted and that really change the construction practices. With regard to small island states and low-cost solutions, I think it would be great. I'd love to chat and think that through. Some of the approaches that we've been showing are deliberately very low cost. When I visited some small island states in the Caribbean, I also get a strong sense of community in these places. I've been in St. Lucia and Jamaica. I get such a strong sense of a community. And I wonder if the participatory type of approaches, where you get sensors out into the street, might actually go down quite well and get local conversations started as well.
So Nick, do we have time for one more, perhaps? I'm over here.
Good afternoon. With regards to the Johannesburg project, I just understood that you said that you do not implement. But I would still like to know, with regards to your adaptation strategies, is there any institution, organization that has actually implemented any of the strategies, and how has it affected the communities with regard to temperatures, with regards to the social impacts that you have said where children are not able to learn on these things? I am from a small island, and whereas you may recommend to approach institutions such as engineers, it will not work for us unless it is enforced. So it would have to go through the Development Control Authority or certain institutions that would actually enforce policies, because even if it may bring environmental benefits, but all those professionals will look at how it would benefit them financially. So unless there are benefits or incentives, I don't see it working this way. So I just want to know if there are any institutions that have actually implemented your adaptation measures and how it has worked and benefited overall.
Should we just gather there was one more question. Should we just gather around and then?
Thank you for your presentation. I like to know that when we will heat wave is surely a disaster. It is a disaster, and like other disaster, like cyclone, then flood, we have some signature after the disaster. After the cyclone, we will see that what happened in which scale or like that. Okay. Same thing for flood and some riverbank erosion like that in my country, in Bangladesh. I'm from Bangladesh. But have you established any scale for heat wave action? Any scale you have fixed up? That in suppose what I'm like to tell you that in 30 degree or 35, 40 or 45 degree health effect or effect on community income and community management, this type of effect will evident. Have you established that type of scale?
So I'll take the first one, and just I think as a matter of offering clarity, when I said we don't implement, I was speaking from a municipal level. There are different departments. Our department specifically, which has the climate change mandate, is more policy and strategy driven. The implementation happens. We try and make sure we drive implementation at the different departments. So when we speak about our energy efficiency or mitigation goals that speak to energy, we would set the targets with our sector leads, but the implementation will happen at the energy department. So in terms of what in terms of us not implementing it from an institutional perspective. Definitely we are. Where this work has been quite essential and where we're generally lacking as a city is technical data. As a city, we under-resourced as a climate change division, so we don't have the technical capabilities to actually undertake such monitoring or even do the modeling ourselves. So this work comes in and bridges the gap. So we've been doing some tree planting, a number of adaptation. I mean, it's not as great as, and it's not as where it should be, but there's a number of interventions we may have in the city. But in the absence of data, you are not able to direct your efforts in the right places. That's the first part. And then secondly, monitor whether you're making a difference or not. So now when you're dealing with councillors and changing political structures, this sort of work already gives us the motivation to say, you know what, we need to table it and we need to start saying any projects that, if we're thinking about parks projects that need to happen, we need to, or greening project that needs to happen, we need to be directing it there. And it also just gives us an imperative to push more of our other biodiversity restoration projects to say, you know what, we need to be focusing on greening these new areas. And there's a lot of new low-cost housing developments happening in South Africa. So now it's just saying we need to have integrated planning and making it mandatory to green those areas as well.
Maybe we can discuss. Maybe we can discuss in person. Maybe. Yeah. Yeah. So regarding your question, what we did is actually we did indeed a study of linking the heat stress that was measured with certain social economic parameters. So I think Nicole showed one figure about the impervious surface and the amount of heat stress that is experienced. What we usually see is that the richer neighborhoods have more trees. Of course, then they have a cooler environment that is that they experience. That is what we saw also in the results of Johannesburg. And in general, it's always the most vulnerable people that experience the highest heat stress. They are living in the outskirts of the city, or usually their houses don't have air conditioning. They don't have, they're not adapted with insulation, for example. So it's these areas that are most vulnerable for the heat stress.
Great. Okay, and very quick comments from me. So on the question about implementations, I hope I can get your contact details and share with you a video that we are currently making, where we have been interviewing chief heat officers at a number of cities around the world to get them to talk about the challenges they face, but also the concrete implementations they've done. So hope to have a dialogue and share that with you. And with regard to in Bangladesh, the question about categorizing heat waves, this is a topic that's right on the money, that's really rising in prominence. And there is indeed a movement that I'm aware of around naming heat waves, the same way that we name hurricanes, as a communication device to make it clearer to people that a really big heat wave is coming, and you need to take actions to protect your health and your family, and to preserve health in them. And categorization based on severity is indeed a key part of that. Doing the groundwork for categorization is also really crucial if we're going to scale up early warnings for heat waves, which is one of the lowest cost interventions to save lives. If people get a heat wave alert on their phone or on the radio or on TV, then they have a few days to think and prepare and take measures that preserve their own health.
All right, thank you everybody for joining us. Some lunch, please.
Thank you.